for several years. And we've been running this event for 2 years now. This quarterly program has been expanding, which is great, and we're very happy to have all of you here. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the sponsors for the event. Josh Simon's hiding somewhere in the audience. Josh Simon's hiding back in the audience. Thank you, Josh. And also the firm of Cornicello, Tendler, and Baumel Cornicello. Thank you. Last but not least, I want to mention that the press is a vital organ of our democracy, and we're honored to have several members of the press here as well. Thank you for joining us. Our panel today is going to last an hour, and in an effort to maximize the conversation, we're going to skip the Q&A that's traditional for this format, and instead our panelists have agreed to make themselves available to the audience afterwards individually, and you're welcome to chat with them after we're done. Our stars today are the panelists. Before I turn to them, I'd like to set the tone of our conversation with a bit of context. The problem of housing affordability in New York is neither a new issue nor a local one. Major cities around the world are struggling with housing costs, especially those with growing populations. New York has faced this problem before, repeatedly in the 1800s. I read recently that between 1810 or 1800 and 1880, the population of New York doubled every 10 years. Again after World War I, again after World War II, and still today. Rent stabilization laws are also not a new feature of the New York City market. I think it's fair to say that everybody would like to live in a healthy, vibrant city that's equitable, meritocratic, and in which its citizens live and treat each other with dignity and respect. I think that we now face a critical juncture in the public debate about what constitutes fairness, both to those who choose to live and work in our city, and as well as those who choose to invest in it, of course recognizing that often those two categories overlap. I'm certain that our panelists will have areas of disagreement, but I'm also equally certain that we will have areas of agreement. It's my hope that in our conversation today we'll be able to focus on both areas. I think more than anything the people in this room are looking for a roadmap to help understand what changes to expect, to the rules of the road, and how to steer their businesses and their livelihoods in response. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists who can help answer that question. I will introduce briefly to my left, Susan Baumel Cornicello of the law firm Cornicello, Tendler, and Baumel Cornicello, Senator Brian Benjamin of the New York State Senate, Adam Leitman Bailey of the law firm Adam Leitman Bailey PC, Councilmember Mark Levine of the New York City Council, and last but not least, Sean Riney of Marcus & Millichap, not Joe Kosum as the card indicates. Joe's out sick. Sean is the #1 producing multifamily broker in the Brooklyn office and spends all of his time engaged with owners of rent-stabilized housing and is a great substitute to discuss that opinion. So I would like to start off by laying some groundwork. It's my desire to start with our two elected officials and talk a little bit about what's on the table and hear from them what's being considered in the Senate and the City Council, what bills are currently being proposed, and where the discussion is taking us behind closed doors. So, Senator Benjamin, if you'd like to start.
Of course.
Great.
I can't wait. First of all, I don't want to thank Andy. Andy reached out to me and said, "Oh, would you come to this small panel?" I said, "Sure," and this is not that small, but but let me just say a few things. Right now, and I beg you kind of started with some context. Right now, as many of you are aware, rent laws will expire in June, and so at this time, the conversation is about what does that look like. Right in this very moment, we're dealing with the budget. And the budget needs to be passed by April 1st. There is no reason for anyone to believe in this room that rent laws will be dealt with in the budget. There was originally a conversation that might be a possibility. That is not a possibility. So it is likely that this issue will be dealt with in June.
Senator Benjamin, they're having trouble hearing you.
Oh,
thank you.
Sorry, a second.
There we go.
I'm not used to be known for speaking quietly, so but I will amplify.
Andy Weiss.
Did anyone hear what I said? Did you hear what I said in the back originally or no?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm seeing some shaking heads. So let me go back to what I said before. The rent laws expire in June. There was a possibility, a very small one, that this could have been dealt with in the budget that needs to be passed by April 1st. That is very unlikely. That's extremely unlikely. So the conversation around rent laws are likely to be dealt, well, not likely, they will be dealt with by June, which means they're probably dealt with in June. There are a number of issues that are on the table, bills that Democratic senators have carried in the past. I know you know all of these things, and obviously, and you've been listening to what the governor's been saying, but I'll just rattle off a few things that are in consideration. One is ending vacancy decontrol, ending the vacancy bonus, sort of revising in some capacity MCIs and IIs and how they're dealt with. Also dealing with preferential rents and what could be the case there. And I think that's the lion's share of it. Off the top of my head, I didn't write this down. But you know what the issues are that you're concerned about, and all of those are on the table. Now, I think what's important is, in this time, is for everyone to be realistic about the world we live in. And I think on both sides, whether you are the most staunch landlord activist or the most staunch tenant activist, we need to listen to each other and hear what the concerns are on both sides. That's not your job, that's our job as elected officials, and our job in the Senate and the Assembly, and for the governor. And I will say, for me personally, my main concerns are, I don't want to create an environment where landlords are not incentivized to invest in properties. I don't want NYCHA 2.0, which is what I call it, to be spread out across the rent stabilized apartments. But I also don't want incentivized financial incentives for landlords to push people out of their homes. And I will say, one of the problems that the industry has is that sometimes the action of the few impacts the perception of the many. And whenever you turn on your television and see that little grandma who just got pushed out of her apartment right before Christmas, and because either rightly or wrongly so, there was a desire to do something with that apartment, that creates an image that is what's driving the narrative. And right now, real estate in general, landlords particularly, are seen as evil people. What is incumbent upon those in this room to do is to try to change that narrative, and also to think about what are your top priorities of things when you look at the range of things we're considering. What are the top priorities? It can't be everything, right? I said, well, the top priorities, well, it's everything. Okay, well, that's not a top priority. But what are your top priorities, and how does it impact what people are concerned about, right? I can't tell you how many, some landlords, maybe in this room or not, have come to some of us and say, oh my God, if you pass these laws, we'll be broken in the street. Meanwhile, they got on the fanciest Ferragamo belt and shoes and everything else. I mean, you got to think about the perception of what you're doing and how you're making your arguments, so that it doesn't fall on deaf ears.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your candor there. So I want to, before we shift to the city perspective, I want to, for a moment, pause. We're coming right back to you. And go to Sean Riney for a little bit of landlord's perspective on that. I think that in the same way that you mentioned a sympathetic figure on the tenant side, I think that there are a lot of landlords who are in the position of struggling with rising taxes, rising water bills. They're small owners, they own 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties. They don't have a deep in-house legal team to deal with legal challenges from tenants. And I think that there are small business owners that fit in that category of a landlord. And I'm curious to hear from Sean a little bit about what the perception is on the other side of this conversation from those types of owners and other owners in regard to what Senator Benjamin had to say.
Sure. Thanks for listening. And again, thank you for coming here. I know that we're not always reaching out to you, and the apathetic middle is not going to change anything. So thank you again for that. I would say that overall landlords are having a psychological gut check about, one, whether this is a sustainable business plan, and then also whether this is a lifestyle that they want to lead. Most of the the theory behind rent stabilized investing for this second that I started was a very long-term, slow roll approach. In theory, when you buy something, 2019 and 2029, your rent roll and your net income should theoretically go up because rents are artificially held lower by regulation, which makes it a very attractive investment because it's recession-proof and you can kind of have a predictable growth pattern. Now, one of the things you mentioned, Senator Benjamin, which I think goes unnoticed, is it's kind of like you can't have your cake and eat it too, because what's been happening in a lot of the asset valuation rise has been based on interest rates, fluctuating down, but NOI growth really hasn't been, I think, what has been purported out there.
And if you can say NOI, what then?
NOI, net operating income. So the things that have been rising very fast are water and sewer and mostly property taxes. So every January 15th, everyone gets the piece of mail, and there's no really, it's a big surprise what the taxes are going to increase, but we can't, have a system where the system is created where to keep up with the Joneses, you have to have turnover. And so without kind of at least fixing some of the controlled expenses on the expense side, you're going to create this scenario where there has to be turnover to raise income because the 1% doesn't do it. So I think, on one side of the shuffle is really that, and things like eliminating the preferential rent, right? Like for the typical owner that I talked to, in 2009, I was helping them reduce their property taxes when there's nothing else to do. Now I'm helping them, assuage their rent overcharge risk. When we talk about eliminating preferential rents, the signal that sends to owners that you're penalizing the very people that actually were keeping the rents affordable. And so this all goes into the gut check aspect of, I was doing everything that you said, and I'm actually the ones keeping things affordable. So most of our valuations are actually coming from people that have owned the buildings for 30, 40 years that historically were never sellers, and now they're just like, I need to get out of New York and buy me a property in Florida or a single tenant net leased asset. But these are the very owners that were keeping things affordable all these years. So I think that gets lost in the shuffle a little bit. I think we can all agree, anti-harassment, we're all for. There's a lot of room for agreement, but we just, I think, is on the landlord side, I'm sure we'll get into this, want to make sure that there's enough incentive to maintain properties because they don't maintain themselves. So that's it. I think it summarizes what most mom and pop landlords are feeling.
And the incentives to maintain are exactly what Senator Benjamin said about protecting the IAIs and the MCIs. I agree, yeah. So to turn for a second to the attorneys on the panel, the regulatory framework that we have, and you mentioned, both of you who have spoken have mentioned this briefly, the regulatory framework that we have lends itself at times to misuse by both sides of the debate, right? There are certainly tenants who are living a nice life, and certainly some who are misusing the system, and the same with landlords. How do you see that happening, and where do you see the holes in the system that could be helped to help improve the system to make it more equitable on both sides, so that there is less contention and less, as you said, bad actors and evidence of those bad actors? Susan.
Abuse, which really is the one most upsetting to me, is that there could be apartments that are renting for $1,000 a month because maybe they're controlled or they're a succeeding tenant, and the actual persons in occupancy are making $500,000 a year. Obviously, they don't need protection and subsidized rent. I see it all the time. It's not an unusual thing to see. Also, non-primary residents. There are a lot of tenants out there who, because they're paying artificially suppressed rents, can now go out and afford second homes, sometimes even third homes I've seen. And it's not unusual for a tenant to have multiple homes and a landlord to discover and to try to recover. And it's quite difficult. The courts make it very, very difficult to try to recover an apartment based on a non-primary residence ground. Additionally, we see some profiteering and rent gouging. I see it all the time. Tenants utilizing Airbnb, tenants just renting out rooms for rents that far exceed the proportionate share. These are things that I see all the time as an attorney representing landlords.
So if I can ask you to take the devil's advocate position for a second. On the landlord side, we all know there are bad actors on both sides. What are some of the things that can be fixed to rein in those bad actors to make the rest of the landlords that are doing the right thing look good?
Well, I think that, first of all, it starts in the courts, because it's the courts that are making it so difficult for us to proceed as landlord attorneys. We walk into a courthouse and, you know, especially in New York County and Kings County, we're already at a disadvantage. You know, we already are struggling to even get a case heard on that day or to get use and occupancy. It's very, very difficult. So, I mean, if it was easier to handle a case in housing court where a tenant is profiteering or a tenant is illegally subletting or where a tenant is not living in the apartment and maybe using it for storage, which is very common actually, or using an apartment, you know, to profit off of, then I think it would be a whole lot easier.
So I want to return to the subject of judicial efficiency in a moment, because I want to hear what Councilmember Levine has to say on that as a prominent activist on the subject. But before we do, I want to ask Adam to please fill in the same question for us. How do we fill some gaps in the system?
It's interesting, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for having us. It's interesting listening to all of your answers and being an attorney for the last 25 years, representing landlords and tenants, and listening to the words you're using. But I look at the big picture from way up in the sky. Look at the system we're under. This rent regulation, the system we're under, is from 1969 and 1972 and 1974. July 1st it started. Based on World War II emergency, based on 5% vacancy, a 5% vacancy problem, and that is what we're living off of today. So wait, we're arguing over this, we're having these great debates, tremendous amount of legal fees, money, taxpayers' money, fightings, you know, laws being proposed. Councilman Levine just proposed something where every tenant that signs a new lease get 4 years of their rent history, the last 4 years of the last tenant's rent history handed to them, causing more and more anti-business, anti-landlord anxiety. The system is broken. The system is dangerous. The system is a waste of time and money. It's a horrible system.
Can you please tell us how you really feel?
You're right, I should get to the point. So we have these other landlords we represent, and they're called 80/20 buildings. And they got, this is the same reason Amazon left. They got these tax incentives, and they agreed to put their buildings in a program. So instead of winning a housing lottery, where these rent-regulated tenants that Councilman Levine and State Senator Benjamin are, you know, fighting for these people's rights, these people in these 80/20 buildings had to apply instead of, I'm sorry, let me go slower. The current rent-regulated tenants received rent regulation because they moved in on a certain date. Because they moved in on a certain date, they won the lottery. And that caused them not to buy property like their peers, and that's a whole other debate of how it kept them from becoming rich, and there's many articles and papers on this. But without getting into the big stuff, because we don't have time, but what it's caused in these 80/20 buildings is they apply based on their income. They apply based on their jobs. We give it to heroes, nurses, police officers, and those that have financial need. Imagine a system where someone needs the apartment based on income need, and they have to apply, they get accepted. Then the agency, they hire an independent agency. The landlords are not allowed to watch over themselves. They have to hire an independent agency, and they watch over if they're violating any of the laws. Now, because these people are there in financial need, there's just very few cases we ever have to start. It's bad for my business, but there's very few cases because these people are there for financial need. They're not going and subletting the non-private residents They don't have 3 homes. Why? Because these are people that need the homes.
Well, let me shift the conversation for a second, because I think you raise a very legitimate point. I think that 80-20 is a great program. And I think that most people would agree that it's valuable to keep a spectrum of incomes in the city. And I think that we can all agree on that. I also want to say that you said that the people who moved into stabilized apartments won the lottery. I want to also point out that all of us live in 21st century New York. We've all won the lottery. If you look back at the options for history and geography, we're all winning in some way.
I respectfully disagree. Let me point out point of order. Let me just say that. Imagine if we took a million rent-regulated apartments off the market. Imagine those of you that are renting, what your rents would be, how much lower they would be, how many more choices would you have to rent if we took a million apartments off the market and made them free market. How much cheaper would your rents be?
I think that's a legitimate.
I don't think the average New Yorker has hit the lottery. I think we're being robbed.
Well, I think that there's validity in your point, but I think also, even if all the stabilized apartments came back on the market, even if the market was more fluid and uncontrolled, there is geographic disparity within the city, right? So even if all the stabilized apartments in the West Village come on the market, it's not going to become inexpensive to live in the West Village. It may become more inexpensive to live in Sheepshead Bay. But there are geographic differences within the city, and there are submarkets. And I think that geographic dispersion of affordability has legitimacy. But I want to return, before we get too far down that path, and I want to return to what we're talking about, efficiency in the courts. Councilmember Levine, you were the sponsor of a pioneering recent legislation, which was the first in the nation, guaranteeing legal representation to tenants in housing court. Can you talk a little bit about the impetus behind that legislation and what the reception has been that you've found so far?
Darn, I was hoping you would not notice I'm sitting up here. But alas, thank goodness I'm here with Senator Benjamin. You can't see the bulletproof vests that but that was an arrangement we made before we came here. My goodness, I actually do want to offer a big picture as a counterpoint to Adam's grand vision, which is to say that I am extremely worried, and I think most of my colleagues in the City Council are extremely worried that some of the qualities that have made New York City the best city in the world are under threat, that they're being eroded. We love this city because it's a place where people of all backgrounds and all incomes can live and have lived for generations. A place where a low-income immigrant can come and make a life. A place where a bus driver or a nurse can afford to pay for housing and raise a family. A city of neighborhoods with mom and pop stores and quirky, interesting, unique retail that gives our neighborhoods a soul. And that's under threat. And so we're working to use the tools we have in the council at the city level, together with our colleagues at the state, to try and protect what makes New York the best city in the world. And so that does mean we're using our tools to help existing buildings retain their diversity, their income diversity. It means that we're using our tools to help ensure that new construction also includes income diversity. It includes units that are devoted to affordability. And we're using our tools, limited though they are, to try and make this a city where mom and pop businesses can continue to thrive. But man, we're losing ground in a lot of these fights. And I think if the island of Manhattan becomes a place where only millionaires can afford to live, this is not going to be the New York that all of us have come to love. And you only have to walk for a few blocks to see the way we're hemorrhaging mom and pop retail, and it is being replaced often by chains and more commonly now by long-term vacancy. And so, we're doing everything we can to try and prevent these losses. And I represent a district which is 85% rental. I represent a district in northern Manhattan, parts of West Harlem, Washington Heights, a little bit of the West Side. And there may be some residents and some tenants who are wealthy and don't need the benefit of rent regulation. But I'll tell you that for 99% of them, if they lose that apartment, they're in deep trouble. And maybe they'll find a way to double up with a family member. Some of them will land in homeless shelters. Some will just have to move out of New York if they can pull that off. But the stakes are really, really high for these families. That reflects the vast majority of who is living in these rent-regulated units. Hold on. You'll get your time. I know every one of you is concerned about the homeless crisis. You should be concerned about the homeless crisis. Last night, I think the census was over 61,000 in the shelter system. Other than the Great Depression, that's unprecedented for the city. And who is in those shelters might not be who you think it is. It is not mostly single men who are dealing with mental illness or substance use issues. It is mostly families. 70% of the people in the shelter system are families. And the number one reason why they tell us that they landed in the shelter is evictions. And so if you want to grapple with the homeless crisis, you have to grapple with the eviction epidemic. And there's just no way around it. So I'm very proud to have passed legislation last year that brings a little more of a level playing field to housing court. It ensures that people who are facing a life-altering judgment have the benefit of representation. I think anyone facing a life-altering judgment, whether that's incarceration, loss of your freedom, whether it's deportation, whether it's loss of custody of your kids, or loss of your home, needs to have the due process that you can only get when you have an attorney on both sides. And so this is a bill we passed in 2017. It's a 5-year implementation. It's being rolled out zip code by zip code, starting in the zip codes that are sending the most people to homeless shelters. And it has been yielding great results. And some of you might not want to admit it, but I've even heard from folks on the landlord side that it is bringing more efficiency to housing court. But the critical thing is that now we are getting data that says fewer people are showing up in homeless shelters who are citing eviction as the cause. So there's a public policy benefit and a human benefit that I'm really proud of. I'm out of time, but I'm happy to talk about the other ways.
So I want to circle, before we come back to your point, I want to circle to Susan for a second, because Susan represents landlords in housing court, and I would like your feedback on that legislation and what that means from your perspective.
It's actually been a plus for our clients.
Oh, wow, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Is this being recorded?
Well, for one, from the landlord's perspective, it's nice to have a 2-attorney stipulation. It's just, it feels better for, to walk out of court having 2 attorneys. The judges don't have to act as counsel for the tenants, so things can go quicker. Tenants don't necessarily trust when a landlord's entering into a stipulation and they're pro se, and all the landlord's trying to do is get an access date to go in and do a repair. They don't trust the landlord, so it becomes more difficult. And it even speeds everything up, because when a case is adjourned, in the interim, a landlord attorney can pick up the phone and call the tenant attorney and say, hey, look, we have a problem with access, we can't make it, can you try to get us access the next day? And it's actually been quite successful. If there's one little thing that I could tweak, it's maybe perhaps when a tenant goes and files an answer in court, they can do an intake there to see whether the tenant qualifies for representation, instead of waiting till the case goes to the part, and then the part does the intake, and then the case has to be adjourned. So it'd be better if the intake was done earlier.
I totally agree. We're working on this.
Okay.
Here we go. That's what I like to see. That was good. All right, now Adam, now it's your turn.
It's been helpful. It's actually, instead of a case with the tenant maybe being 5 court appearances just to make repairs and just to try to get the tenant to pay the rent, the tenant attorney can help them go and find resources and, you know, tells them, no, you have to provide access. You made a complaint, you must provide access. So it's actually been a good thing. Thank you, Council President.
I really believe that Councilman Levine wants to do good for the citizens of New York. And I really wish that he was born in Bayside, Queens, like I was in 1970. And he lived through the streets. Because when he was speaking, what he was telling you was, we have a large homeless problem, which is very different than our regulation on our tenant. See what's going on? We have a large homeless problem because people need jobs. And jobs and a lot of tenant problems are actually very
30% of these single parents in the homeless system are employed while in the shelter. They just can't pay the rent.
So if people have better paying jobs, which we can help with, if the government, including the council, if we weren't anti-business, if we weren't anti-landlord, if we were pro-business, if we were doing the incentives that would cause an Amazon to come and stay, it would cause businesses to want to help and provide more jobs and give these people in our centers more pay and better jobs, we wouldn't have the problem in homeless centers. It's a different problem in our regulation. Let me give you an example. There's a new law you probably don't know about. In order to buy out a tenant now, you have to go through a bunch of, the law is a little complicated. You have to basically go through 9 different things before you can speak to the tenant about buyout. If a tenant says, no, I don't want to buy out, you have to wait 6 months to speak again. But what's missing, by not being on the ground and in the streets and understanding the average person is the average rent-regulated tenant, because I represent landlords and tenants, the average rent-regulated tenant is over 60 years old. Many of them are over 70. And they're coming into us on both sides, and they're saying, I can't walk 4 flights of stairs anymore. I need the elevator. I need to move to Florida. And the landlords want to buy them a place to move to. So a lot of the tenants both agree on, both have a goal, a dream. Because I'm on both sides of this. They want to move to Florida to be able to buy a place, and all of them want to give them the money. The government jumped in and made it difficult, almost impossible, for them to make a deal right now.
So Adam, let me ask you a question. Let me interrupt you for a second and ask you a question.
Let me just finish.
Go ahead.
So what he's saying about the homeless shelters and rent regulation are just complete opposites. It's like apples and oranges.
Let me ask you for
Reds and roses.
a question about solutions, right? So I heard you say that rent-regulated tenants have acquired a tremendous amount of equity, right? Many of them forewent the opportunity to buy homes because they had an inexpensive place to live. And now, in essence, the depressed rent is their homeowner's equity. And getting that check is their ability to basically retire in some, and I won't say many, but some cases, right? So there's clearly also cases of abuse. The government's action has been to try and curb that abuse. So if you feel that the action that has been taken is overly restricted, what would you suggest as a regime in which we can protect those who are in jeopardy while also continue to enable this part of the system, which maybe is an unintended consequence, but a valuable one, to function?
So my system would be as follows. I would renew, as Senator Benjamin stated, I would renew the rent-regulated laws in June. I would do that. Because you're not putting, and these are senior citizens now, you're not putting them on the street, and no landlord in this room or in New York wants to do that. Then I'm just interested in throwing anyone on the street. And most of these landlords, almost all of them are good people. The few bad ones that are out there, it's bad for the whole community, and it's a system that causes them to be bad, but they still shouldn't do it. So I'm not supporting them either. What I'm saying is, if you have a different system, the person gets the apartment because they have need, and you're giving the landlord tax incentives to take on these tenants, then you're not going to have any of these issues. You won't need these excess laws. You won't have these problems. And now, what Councilman Levine was referring to were the business rent control, business rent regulation.
Well, I don't want to go down that road yet.
You're gonna bury
Go into
New York.
retail.
You're gonna really bury and cripple New York if that goes down that road. And those homeless shelters, you're gonna need many new ones if that actually goes through.
All right, well, I want to stay on apartments for the moment. And you mentioned something about 80-20, which I think was valuable, and I want to circle back to ideal scenarios. But Senator Benjamin, you had a comment. You started us off, and we went on a wild train ride, so.
We sure have. I want to go back to the world of the practical for a second, because in Albany, in Albany, we're going to make decisions on rent law, and there are a couple things that got mentioned that I want to pick up on just to give you a sense of perspective. Joe, I'm sorry, what's your name? Sean mentioned the point about preferential rents. And the way in which he mentioned the point was to talk about it from the landlord perspective and the fact that, you know, this affordable housing, et cetera. The renter who is dealing with the good landlord who is, where they have that preferential rent, we never hear from that person, right? That, like, we as elected officials, there's not a bunch of renters walking into our office saying, you know, I have a great landlord, I'm so excited that, you know, I have this preferential rent and it's really helping me live. That is exciting, and I just want to say that I love my landlord, and when you get a chance, can you call that person and just thank him for, you understand what I'm saying? That's not who comes to our office. The person who comes to our office is the person whose preferential rent is expiring, and as you know, as the laws work now, you can take that preferential rent immediately away, and you can go from whatever that rent is to the legal rent. In some cases, that's $1,000, $1,500, a significant number, and we get bombarded with people, particularly where I represent, which is Upper West Side in Harlem, where there's a lot of changes, many of you know. We get bombarded with people who are complaining that landlords are abusing the preferential rent system to push them out of their homes. So that is what we're hearing. So it's interesting. I just want to put that in perspective for you. You might look at one thing one way, but we're experiencing it a very different way. So when we're saying preferential rents has to be addressed, it's because we're not hearing from those who like the system. That's number one. Number two, I think it's important to know, because I was listening to the exchange just now, I think it's important to know that there's the raw facts of who's in charge, okay? The Senate Republicans were in charge for a very long time, as many of you know. They're now not in charge. I'm glad you're excited about that, because they're now not in charge. But this is the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is we are going to have to deal with the fact that the laws are going to move to the left, more tenant friendly, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to, you know, you all know this. It's just some people might not want to accept it yet. Some people wish the Republicans are back. But the truth of the matter is, you have to be thoughtful about what is it that you believe are the one or two things that we need to be knowledgeable about. What I desperately need is to hear reasonable arguments about how, if you do X, this is the implications that I will have, so that those of us legislators who want to be reasonable and want to be thoughtful about this can be thoughtful about this. Just hearing about philosophy and the world's going to end and, oh my God, I wish the Republicans were in charge, doesn't really help anybody, because they're not. We now have 39 Democrats, and it's unlikely in 2020 that's going to change with Trump on the ballot. So the truth of the matter is that what you've got to do is move beyond the emotion, and I'm not saying emotional arguments and philosophy aren't important, but move beyond that and talk about, okay, practically, these are our concerns with this, that, and the third. This is why the vacancy bonus is relevant. This is why IIs are relevant. This is why MCRs are relevant. We can, you know, and it's got to be more of a negotiation kind of mindset. Not saying that there's some people on my side that I even want to negotiate, but the bottom line is that's where the argument is. Because if not, then this decision is going to get made without the people who are on the landlord side in the conversation. And we're just going to make a decision. And that's what it's going to be, because that's how politics works. So I just want to put that out there, because I think it's important to folks to know politics and you know, the legislature is a little different than the city council and the city. But in our world, we deal with the practical, but we have to make decisions. And so I need good arguments that I can make to people who are reasonable, that I can make to myself. right? Because the fact of the matter is, in my office, I hear all the time from the aggrieved tenant who is concerned about how the vacancy bonus is being used, how preferential being used, how MCIs are being used, and how IIs are being used. And so that's where we are. I don't know, Mark, if you have a different perspective on that, but that's where we are. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come, to be frank, was to kind of hear and let you know that there are members like me who want to hear both sides, right? Not everybody wants to hear both sides, and that's just the truth of it.
Which I think everyone in this room appreciates. It. Thank you. So I'd like to turn to Sean for a second, because Sean spends all of his time on the phone with people who own rent-regulated buildings. So what do you think about what Senator Benjamin said and the specific arguments for and against those particular recommendations, II change, MCIs?
100%. I think we can all agree on harassment. There's a lot of areas. If I had to single out two that I hear mostly from, the fabric of the landlords that are holding, the city together, it's if you remove MCIs and IAIs, there will be a significant drop in property valuations and a significant resignation, capitulation, whatever you want to call it, on maintaining the buildings that were bought under previous rules. The economics changed drastically, and the incentive to, I think you have some background in real estate. I mean, a 20-unit building with this much regulation is a full-time job. So the one unintended consequence is, significant resignation on the part of landlords, specifically the ones that have, really bought in the last 10 years, but even, like I said, most of our listeners right now are people that have owned for 40, 50 years just saying, to hell with this place, I can't be a target anymore. So we want to come up with a sensible approach, calling people predators, we all know what that invokes, that doesn't help the conversation clearly. So I would focus on MCIs and IAIs. I think that those, if they're used correctly, help maintain the property. So we want to create affordable housing. I hear the Bosnians pledge, but what gets missed in that conversation is affordable and well-maintained properties. That extra $10 a month if you're living in a quality building, I think helps that person's psychology a lot, get that next job. So there's a lot of over leverage if everything is being used at once, and I'm already having kind of owners kind of prep for their own resignation, saying they can get the keys back. So I just think these neighborhoods, if everything happens at once, minor adjustments like raising the deregulation threshold from 25 to 27, that didn't upset the market. You want to raise that again, that's not going to kill anybody. Have a tenant form for every buyout, okay, but the taxes, you can't have the double whammy of the taxes and the expenses going up with kind of very small increases and just putting that burden on the property owner. And the last thing I'll say, and using the Amazon example, is the small landlord cannot keep up. They cannot keep up with all the regulations, and so what's going to happen is Blackstone's going to buy the whole city. So if all this happens, the only people that can buy them are people that are full-time management companies, the exact type of owner that you don't want, and have a monopoly over the city, but those are the only buyers for these buildings right now. You have to have the economies of scale. If a guy that owns 3 or 4 buildings thinking about buying another one, try to help me find that, because they don't exist right now. So
Appreciate that.
I would say those are the unintended consequences.
Susan, as also a landlord representative, do you have any responses to Senator Benjamin's invitation to say, here are the things that are really going to cause problems for clients?
Well, the first question I have for Senator Benjamin is, how would he like the 300 or 250 people here to give you information about what they find important?
In what form?
In what form? Do you want them to send you emails? Do you want them to send you letters?
That's a dangerous invitation.
Tenants are very good at expressing their rights, and you're right, that's what you hear. But, in a building, let's say there are, I think I read a number somewhere that there may be 200,000 preferential rents out there, a number like that. And then how many complaints have you received? A dozen out of 200,000? It's not that prevalent.
The number one constituent issue in my office is housing. And I have a full-time staff. I have 3 people on staff who 2 deal with housing all day. So it's not, I don't know.
I'm talking about preferential
maybe
rents.
Maybe on the east side is different.
I was just talking about preferential rents. Right, so I mean, it's a very small amount of people making a lot of noise. Most landlords do offer preferential rents because it's beneficial to the tenants. Maybe they want to help the tenant out. Maybe, you know, there's a change in the market. Maybe the tenant lost their job or they're down to one income. For whatever reason, you know, there's a preferential rent. I mean, that's just one issue. MCIs and IAIs, those are huge. You know, if an owner is spending, you know, 60% of their income, thank you, on taxes, insurance, utilities, before even debt service, you know, and now you're taking away IAIs and you're taking away MCIs, and the RGBOs are very low, and I know I'm using a lot of letters here, you know, where is an owner supposed to go? You know, you start going into black.
Real quick.
Yes, please.
It's, you know, it's not, okay. I love when we have these conversations. On one side, it's the absolute extreme, the other side is the absolute extreme. It's not taking away emphasize IIs. The thought is there's probably some place in the middle or some kind of, right? So there's where we are now, and then there's absolutely on the other extreme. You're saying it's going here. No, not necessarily.
There's
some room between,
there's a bill.
There's a bill for everything. You know how many bills we have? I mean, that's
We all have bills.
Right, everyone has a bill, right? I mean, I know some people have thousands of bills. And so what? The bottom line is, at the end of the day, we have to make a decision. Either we're going to go to non-MCIs, which is a possibility, but the point is, or there's someplace else, right? That's not here. And so that's the nuance that we can get into, as opposed to the talking points that everyone likes to use on both sides, in my opinion.
And Senator, how does the legislation reach that middle point or reach a point?
Susan, you're bringing up a great point, which I think is a little inside baseball, right? Which is, there's clearly a very progressive wing in the Democratic caucus right now. There's a more moderate wing. How can you give us a little color, and maybe Councilmember Levine, you can jump in here a little bit about what's happening inside your two respective chambers to come to, we all know, everybody in this room knows, extremes get proposed on both sides. We end up in the middle. I don't think that anybody believes that all units in all of New York State are going to be stabilized, rents frozen, everything's over, although that has been proposed. So the question is, how is that process happening internally? Can you give us any color as to what those conversations look like inside?
Well, most of these laws are set in Albany, so, but I'll just say, and I can pass it back to Brian, but some of these tools are being abused. You know, with MCIs, you're allowed to keep charging them in perpetuity. And it's one thing to say you have to recoup the capital you invested, but you can go decades and you're still getting that money from the tenant. That's not fair. Preferential rents are often used to lure in a low-income tenant, and then boom, they're hit with a 20, 30, 50% rent increase, which, while legal under the current rules, is certainly not the intent of rent regulations, which are supposed to insulate low-income tenants from that. And one of the reasons why it's done is so that you can quickly cycle. The tenant's going to have to leave. They can't take that kind of increase, and then you get the vacancy bonus. So you can just rapidly cycle through tenants and keep pumping up the vacancy bonus, which undermines the spirit of the law. So there's work we need to do to, in my opinion, create fairer rules around this that protect vulnerable tenants.
So individual apartment.
Let me, before you go down that road, let me just respond to the question, and then you can go ahead.
Yeah.
All right. So, to Mark's point, the goal of what we're going to be trying to do over the next few months is to figure out a way where we can reduce the ability for these excesses and these concerns. I know most people in the room don't participate in what Mark said, but there are people who do, and that's what we hear the most. And so we want rules that don't allow for that, but allow for business to work. That's number one. Number two, now how do we make decisions? Typically what we do as a Democratic caucus is we meet as a conference. Some issues like this will be discussed amongst us, and there'll be people who have opinions both one way or the other, and then ultimately leadership makes leadership decides how to move forward. But as it relates to the rent laws, it's going to be the speaker and the majority leader and the governor, and we're going to have, and it's going to be back and forth. Obviously, the speaker is going to be influenced by the will of his membership. Our majority will be influenced by the will of her membership, and then the governor is influenced by whatever he decides on that day. So that's how that's going to all work. And so yes, there have been bills that have been introduced. It's kind of like the Ocasio-Cortez phenomenon. She introduces a bill, and that becomes what the Democratic Party believes. The bottom line is there have been bills that have introduced that you can waive, but at the end of the day, whatever those bills are, whatever those ideas are, we're going to sit down as the 39 of us, and we're going to be with our leader, and we're going to talk about it. And those who have more knowledge are going to have more of a say. So, for example, right now we're dealing with criminal justice reform. We have someone who's a former prosecutor, Todd Kaminsky. In that conversation, as we're figuring out what to do, he has a bigger voice to some of us because he knows the system, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing will happen on this, and then we will make the best decision that we can as a Senate. That will be led by our leader in the negotiation and conversations with the governor, and that's what will happen with rent laws. So if one member introduces a bill for this or that, that does not become the will of the conference, because every member, it's not like, for example, for you to introduce a bill, the leadership has to decide, yes, I like this bill, you can introduce it. You know, members have free will to introduce legislation that they want, because as members, that's your right? And so I just want to put that in perspective for you, that just because we have people who introduce bills, that doesn't mean that that's the will of the entire body.
I think that inherent in what you said is a challenge to everyone in the real estate community, which I think is valid, to come forward with proposals that help to address and curb abuses where they exist in order to protect the larger population of people who are abiding by the rules and don't want their value infringed by an overstepping in order to address the bad actors. I think that's a very legitimate challenge.
To some degree, right? I mean, and by the way, you can turn your eyes to what someone might be doing. I'm not saying you in general, I'm not saying this particular, but just understand whenever, you know, to Mark's point, you know, what Mark referenced, and I saw some people cringing when he was saying it, that's not, I've heard those scenarios multiple times. Now, I would agree with you, I don't deal with that all day long, but, you know, it's like if you hear something that's really bad multiple times, it's your job as legislator to try to fix it. Mm-hmm. And to your point, many of us are not from real estate, don't understand all the nuances, and so as a result, might implement things that might overstep in some ways or what have you. But you know, that's where you have to be sort of thoughtful about, you know, presenting arguments to us. Now, I know you're ready to go, so I'm gonna stop speaking. But I just wanted to kind of put that out there before we move forward.
Just like to educate
Go ahead.
as well.
I'm happy to be educated.
No, not just in general. So individual apartment improvement and major capital improvements are improvements. That means, so what Councilman Levine and Senator Benjamin are saying is, you know, let's not increase the rent of tenants. That's the focus. I'd actually look at something very different. When a tenant gets an improvement, a major capital improvement, which is a lot of money spent by a landlord, or an individual apartment improvement, which is a good amount of money, then wait, what happens? Who does the work? The landlord? No, they hire someone. They're hiring employees. They give them jobs. Those people get jobs and they get paid. And they don't just bring one person in. They're hiring, even for a 20-person building, there's 20-something people working on each unit. And then there's 20 units being worked on. So there's how many jobs being provided? And those jobs feed families. And where do those people live? In New York City. And where does money go? It keeps them out of the homeless shelter. So why would we, to protect people and to keep their rent low, who are in their 60s and 70s, who really need, you know, services now, we should be focusing on, why would we take away money from people that have jobs to keep them out of the homeless shelter? The nine scariest words in the English language, according to Ronald Reagan. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That's the problem.
All right. We've talked about problems enough for a second. All right, one more.
So, let me just give you a perspective that I've heard. Okay, one of the perspectives that I've heard that is not an unreasonable thought, which is why, if someone, a tenant moves out of the apartment, why do you get a 20% vacancy bonus and the IAIs? The argument is, shouldn't it be one or the other? I mean, because you're basically, what is the vacancy bonus for if not to pay for whatever changes? And or if you're going to get IAIs to pay for the changes, then what do you need the vacancy bonus for? And so what I'm saying is, these are legitimate questions, right? And oh, you sure can.
So the,
All right, hold on. Adam,
You don't have to do it right now.
Hang on one second. Because we're running out of time. It's all right, it's okay. We're running out of time, and I think that we all know that this debate can go on through 5 p.m. So I don't want to go down that road. What I'd like to do, we have about 5 minutes before we're going to cut this off, and then all of our panelists will be available to take questions afterwards. We're going to step down, and you'll be able to talk to them individually, politely. And I think that the note I'd like to end on is one of positivity. I think that back to where I started the conversation with the intro, everybody wants a healthy and vibrant city in which people are respecting each other. I think that, Adam, you raised a very intelligent and important point. 80-20 buildings are very valuable because they're correlated to the problem of income issues and affordability. I think there's another argument in there about
and you get
stabilization.
tax incentives, so they.
It'll be your turn in just 1 minute. It's there are arguments in favor of stabilization, right? Because stabilization promotes continuity in the neighborhood. A person who's lived in a neighborhood for 40 years, if they're so lucky as to be promoted and make more money and grow in their profession, to tell them you're leaving your church or your synagogue, you're leaving your friends, you're leaving this neighborhood, we're moving you to a different building that you now qualify for, is a difficult conversation, and I recognize that there's emotion on both sides. With that being said, neither of these systems is therefore perfect. No system is perfect. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing entirely straight can be built. Nothing is perfect. With that being said, if we were all on the panel to idealize a system, if we could design New York for our elected officials to help us build and for the people in this room to help us build, what would that ideal system look like? We talked a lot about supply today, supply issues. Does that mean more transportation so that previously inaccessible areas are accessible to the core jobs and therefore there's more supply of housing essentially available? Does it mean a reformed DOB and an expedited permitting process? Does it mean rezoning, adding more areas to build large buildings and house more people? Those I think are all legitimate ideas. I'd love to hear from every member of the panel briefly. And then we're going to wrap up so that there's time for the audience to speak with the panelists afterwards. We'll start at the end, coming back towards me.
I just think 2 things, and I think some of my points. It's got to be tax relief, tax class 2 properties, which is 11 units and up. You can't raise taxes and expect people to not feel that need to keep in the same place. So that has to come as part of the reform package. There's a lot of empty lots that are sitting with very low taxes. Raise the taxes on the empty lots, promote the development with the affordable component and tax class.
Fabulous contribution. Thank you, Sean.
I just want to point out that progressives took over both sides of City Hall in 2014 and proceeded to make policing a lot fairer in this city, and crime didn't go up, crime continued to drop. We put the most strict requirements on affordability and new development through mandatory and preliminary housing that the city's ever seen, and that did put an end to development. We're at near record levels of building. We have put many rules on the books to make employment fair for workers. Employment is now at an all-time high, 4.5 million jobs in the city. Tourism is booming, and yes, even the valuation of multifamily housing continues to be robust. There's something to learn from all that, which is we can be a fairer city and continue to prosper. And that's my lodestar as a pro-growth progressive, and I'm going to continue to work to see that the city continues to grow and prosper, but does it in a way that reaches everybody and that allows the people who have brought about this success over decades and generations to remain here and benefit from it and not be pushed out at the moment that things are turning around. That's my optimistic vision and one I'm going to continue to fight for.
Thank you. Adam.
Thank you. All of those things that Councilman Levine mentioned are not the result of this mayor or this council or this assembly. They're the result of the years of Mayor Bloomberg and his administration and the former administrations in the Senate and the Assembly worked hard to progress. And as much as this administration is trying to rip those apart, we're still hanging on by tethers. Now, what would be great is we need to build more housing because we don't want homeless shelters and we need people making more money. Why we have laws that are anti-business, anti-landlord, and restricting development make no sense to me.
Which would you change to promote supply? What would you address first to add to the supply?
Well,
Besides complete entity deregulation.
No, I am not for throwing 16 and 17-year-olds out on the street. They should be able to stay. I believe the rents should increase, just like they have for the since the beginning of rent regulation normally. You shouldn't limit the ability for middle-class people to make money off of IIs and MCIs, preferential rents. You know, we shouldn't change laws because when you change a law, then no longer can a person rely on those laws, and therefore they're going to give up and move. And that's one of the worst things you can do is change laws retroactively on people that happened in the Roberts and Steintown case. One of the worst things I've ever seen. We as humans have to rely on certainty. And when things are uncertain and we can't rely on our government, that's when we know we're really at a problem, which is where we're heading. Now, what we want to do is areas where this administration is battling our building higher and building in new places. We want to be able to build in those places. Too many things getting landmarked that don't deserve it. When I walk over and they look like shacks that should be torn down, tear them down and let's build. Let's build affordable housing. I'll end on that.
Thank you.
I want to associate myself with the vision and comments of
I think it's a hit.
No. Councilmember Levine, but I wanted to say something about what we discussed earlier. One is I would like to open up myself to some kind of meeting. Maybe you can help organize this to talk about rent laws specifically. I don't want to talk about wax poetic about other stuff. Just about the rent laws, what's coming up, the issues that we have to deal with in Albany. I'm happy to make myself available because if you all send me some email, I'm not going to read it. So I think the right thing to do is, and we can work on that. You can get some subsection of folks working, and we can kind of have some conversations starting after the budget, because I'm in the middle of the budget, but after the budget in April, because this was going to heat up after April, May heading into June, just so I can, we can have more of a dialogue and get more.
I think that's an admirable and appreciated suggestion. Susan, last but not least.
Well, New York City housing is old. It's as old or older than the infrastructure of New York City. Most buildings are 60, 80, my building is 140 years old. Money must be put into maintenance and capital improvements all the time. It's a necessity to keep status quo for an old building, just as maintenance to the subway tracks is necessary so the subway can keep running. So you must keep incentives to an owner for upgrading properties. Owners should be entitled to obtain MCI increases. Vacancy increases are needed because they are not IAIs always. They could be painting, they could be polishing the floors, they can be maintenance and repair work, and that's costly to get an apartment ready for the next tenant. And those items are not IAIs, so a vacancy increase is needed. But generally, really, just continue the incentives to landlords to keep improving the properties because they need them.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to...
The government suppressing the rental income, and but force assessment every year, increasing our tax. No income but pay more tax. Each year, 20,000 more for the, just couple units.
I'd like to, I appreciate that, and I think you echoed what was said.
Except Sean mentioned a little bit.
Well, he's got the best comments and the best hair.
The senator or civic.
Well, I'd like to,
more people fit into this opinion.
I appreciate that.
Very important.
And I think that you raise a legitimate point, and I think that I think the senator and the councilman will be open to hearing that as soon as we finish. I would like to end by saying thank you, especially to our elected officials. I think a round of applause is warranted. It's clear that we don't agree on everything, but we all appreciate you coming and your willingness to be in a dialogue, because that's how we get to the middle ground that we're all looking for. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you again.